Get that piece of junk off my runway. Ryan Mitchell said it loud, said it slow, said it the way a man says something when he wants every single person within earshot to hear it and agree. He walked straight up to the old T-28 sitting at the end of the flight line, slapped his hand flat against its fuselage hard enough to leave a sound echoing across the tarmac, then turned to face the crowd of pilots behind him with a grin that dared anyone to challenge him. A civilian, a prop plane, in our show, he laughed. Whoever approved this needs their head examined. Every pilot on that tarmac laughed with him. Not one of them knew her name yet. Not one of them knew what that name was going to do to them. If you're new here, subscribe right now and follow this story to the very end, because what Ghost Rider does next will silence every single person on that base. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the first day started the way most mornings at Redstone Valley Air Base started, with jet fuel in the air boots on concrete and young men who were absolutely certain they were the best at what they did. It was a feeling the base practically manufactured. Redstone Valley sat in the high desert of Nevada, far enough from Las Vegas that the lights of the Strip were just a smear on the horizon at night. The base had a reputation. It trained some of the sharpest fighter pilots in the United States Air Force, ran classified flight test programs that didn't appear in any public record. And every single autumn, it hosted the Redstone Valley Air Show, 3 days of screaming engines, rolling thunder, and precision flying that drew crowds from 4 states away. The pilots who flew in that show were selected carefully. Every one of them carried rank credentials, flight hours logged in the tens of thousands. Every one of them had something to prove in the machine to prove it with. So when the roster went up for that year's show and the name Emily Carter appeared at the bottom of the list with the designation Civilian Demonstration Pilot, nobody knew quite what to do with it. Ryan Mitchell knew exactly what to do with it. He laughed. Ryan was 27 years old and had been flying since he was 16. He had accumulated more flight hours before his 25th birthday than most pilots managed in a full career. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of young man who walked into rooms like he already owned them. His fellow pilots called him Mock, not because he'd broken the sound barrier, which he had plenty of times, but because his ego seemed to travel faster than any aircraft they'd ever seen. I was not a bad person. He was not even a bad pilot. He was in fact an exceptional pilot, but he was 27 years old and he had never been truly humbled, and that combination talent without humility had made him into something sharp and sometimes cruel without meaning to be. He found out about Emily Carter the same way everyone else did, through the roster sheet pinned to the briefing room wall. He read her name, read civilian, read the aircraft designation. She'd be flying a T-28 Trojan, a propeller-driven trainer that the Air Force had retired decades ago. And he turned around to face the room with that grin already forming. "Hey," he said, "somebody want to explain this to me." Major Dennis Holt, the air show coordinator, was standing near the coffee station. He was a compact, careful man in his early 50s who had been running the Redstone Valley show for 9 years and had learned to brace himself whenever Ryan Mitchell opened his mouth in that particular tone. "It's on the roster, Captain," Holt said without looking up from his clipboard. "I can see it's on the roster, sir." "That's kind of why I'm asking. Who approved this?" The approval came from the Office of the Air Force Chief of Staff. A beat of silence. "I'm sorry," Ryan said. "It came from where?" "You heard me." Holt finally looked up. His expression was perfectly flat, the way a man's face goes when he's carrying information he's not allowed to share and has made peace with it. "Miss Carter's participation was approved at the highest level of the United States Air Force. That's all I can tell you, and frankly, it's all you need to know. She flies on the second day 2 p.m. slot right after your team's formation run." Any other questions? Ryan had approximately 40 other questions. He kept them behind his teeth, but only barely. Emily Carter arrived at Redstone Valley Air Base on a Tuesday morning in a truck that had seen better decades. It was a blue Ford F-150 that had so many miles on it, the odometer had looped around twice. The passenger side mirror was held on with electrical tape. There was a crack in the windshield that ran from corner to corner like a river on a map. She pulled into the visitor parking area and stepped out. She was 38 years old, which meant she was old enough to be Ryan Mitchell's slightly older sister. And in the world of combat aviation, which operated on the religion of youth and reflexes, 38 felt ancient to certain people. She was lean and quiet-moving with dark hair pulled back simply and a face that didn't advertise much. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, work boots, a jacket that had been washed too many times. She carried a single duffel bag, and she carried a flight helmet under one arm. The helmet was old, older than anything anyone on that base wore. The padding inside had been replaced multiple times. You could see the different colored patches where repairs had been made over years of use. The outer shell was scratched and worn in a way that spoke not of neglect, but of relentless use. There were no decorative stickers on it, no custom paint job, just function stripped down to its essentials. Sergeant Luis Reyes, one of the ground crew chiefs, was the first person to speak to her. He was a big, good-natured man from El Paso who had been working aircraft for 16 years and had developed an instinct for pilots, the way some people develop an instinct for weather. He could tell things about a person from the way they approached a plane, the way they touched it, the way they looked at it. He walked over as Emily moved toward the flight line. "Miss Carter, I'm Sergeant Reyes. I'll be your crew chief for the duration. Can I help you with anything?" "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "I'd like to do a full inspection of the T-28 before anything else. Not the paperwork inspection. The actual aircraft." Reyes nodded slowly. "It's already been signed off by our maintenance crew, ma'am. Full certification." "I appreciate that," Emily said. "I'd still like to do my own." Something in her voice. Not rudeness, not arrogance. Just a certainty that was different from the theatrical certainty he saw in young pilots trying to assert themselves. It was quieter than that, settled, like the statement came from deep experience rather than performance. "Yes, ma'am," Reyes said. "Follow me." The T-28 Trojan was parked at the far end of the flight line, away from the sleek, modern fighters that made up the rest of the show's roster. It looked, frankly, like it had wandered in from a different era, and nobody had gotten around to escorting it out yet. The propeller-driven trainer was a chunky, purposeful machine, not pretty, not fast by modern standards, but extraordinarily capable in the right hands. Emily spent 2 hours on that inspection. 2 hours. She checked the control surfaces by hand, moving each one through its full range of motion and feeling for resistance, for catch points, for anything that didn't translate cleanly through the cable system. She pulled inspection panels that hadn't been pulled during the official maintenance check and looked inside with a flashlight, studying what she found. She ran her hand along the engine cowling and stopped twice, frowning, tilting her head as if listening to something. Sergeant Reyes watched her work. At first, he was merely curious. By the halfway point, he was paying close attention. By the time she finished, he was quiet in a particular way, the way a person gets quiet when they've just recalibrated their understanding of something. "Sergeant," Emily said, "your engine mount on the left side has a stress fracture forming in the secondary bracket. It won't show on a standard visual inspection. You need to pull that mount and get it to your NDT team for a dye penetrant test." Reyes stared at her. "Ma'am, our maintenance crew." "I know, they signed off on it. I'm not questioning their work. I'm telling you what I found. The fracture is early stage. It's probably been there for 30 flight hours. It won't be a problem for the show. But it will be a problem in about 40 more hours if you don't catch it now." She was not asking. She was informing. Reyes got the NDT team to look at it that afternoon. The fracture was exactly where Emily said it was. He'd told no one about this, or at least he tried not to. But aircraft maintenance facilities are small communities with big airs. And by that evening, at least 4 people knew that the civilian woman with the old truck had spotted a fatigue fracture that 3 certified maintenance inspectors had walked past. The information moved through the base. It reached Ryan Mitchell at dinner. He listened to it with a fork halfway to his mouth, then set the fork down, then picked it up again. "She got lucky," he said. The man sitting across from him, Lieutenant Jason Miller, said nothing. Miller was 24, quieter than Ryan by nature, and possessed of an ability to observe things carefully before saying anything about them. He had been watching Emily Carter from a distance since she arrived. He had noticed the inspection. He had noticed the way she moved around the aircraft, not with the showiness of someone performing competence for an audience, but with the absolute economy of someone who genuinely knew what they were looking at. He had a feeling that Ryan Mitchell was wrong. He kept the feeling to himself, for now. The next morning, Emily arrived at the flight line before anyone else. This was a fact that the night security crew would later confirm. She was there at 5:45 a.m., sitting on the wheel of the T-28 with a cup of coffee and a set of topographic maps spread across the engine, Cowling studying them in the thin gray light before sunrise. Not the airshow course maps. Topographic maps. The kind you use when you need to understand the physical shape of the landscape in 3 dimensions. Ridges, valleys, elevation changes the way terrain can create updrafts and downdrafts in invisible corridors of turbulence. Ryan found her there when he arrived at 6:30 for his own pre-show preparation. He stood about 20 feet away and watched her for a moment, genuinely unsure what he was looking at. Then he walked over because Ryan Mitchell had never in his life been able to leave something alone when it confused him. "You're studying terrain maps," he said. It came out somewhere between a statement and an accusation. Emily didn't look up immediately. She finished reading the section she was on, then folded one edge of the map back and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "For the air show." "Yes. It's an air show. The course is marked. It's a flat desert basin. Why do you need terrain maps?" Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Because the basin isn't actually flat. The terrain rises 11 meters over the eastern approach. There's a ridge line at bearing 075 that creates a mechanical turbulence layer at approximately 800 feet in the afternoon when the thermal differential hits. If you're doing precision maneuvering at low altitude on the eastern approach during the 2 p.m. slot and you don't know that ridge is there, you'll encounter unexpected control response at exactly the wrong moment." Ryan stared at her. She had just described the exact slot time of her performance. "You've flown this basin before?" he asked. "No." "Then how?" "I read the maps," she said simply. "It's all in the data if you take the time to look." She turned back to the topographic charts. Ryan stood there for 3 more seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than Ryan Mitchell typically stood anywhere without saying something. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations building. He told himself it was nothing, just a woman who studied maps. That didn't mean she could fly, but something was sitting differently in him than it had been 20 minutes ago, and he couldn't quite identify what it was or where it had come from. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. Emily Carter arrived first and left last. She had a habit of standing on the flight line during other pilots' practice runs, watching. Not with a clipboard, not with a phone or a camera, just watching. Standing with her arms crossed loosely and her eyes tracking every aircraft with the steady attention of someone cross-referencing what they saw against what they knew. Ryan noticed she never missed anything. He noticed because he started watching her watch them, and when he went back later and reviewed his own practice run footage, the moments where she had visibly sharpened her attention corresponded exactly with moments where the execution had been slightly off. A fraction of a degree in a banking turn, a split-second delay in a roll recovery. Small things. Things most observers wouldn't catch. She caught all of them. He went to Jason Miller about it. "She's watching us like she's evaluating," Ryan said. "Like she's actually assessing our technique. She's a civilian demonstration pilot. Why is she evaluating our technique?" Miller thought about this for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Have you considered that she might just be very good at what she's flying, a 40-year-old propeller plane in a show full of fourth-generation fighters?" "That's not what I mean, and you know it," Miller said quietly. Ryan didn't answer. On the afternoon before the show, Ryan passed by the maintenance hangar and overheard Emily talking to Sergeant Reyes and 2 of the younger ground crew members. She wasn't giving a speech. She was answering questions the crew had apparently started asking her, things the way you ask things of a person you've decided actually knows the answers. He stopped outside the doorway and listened. "How do you know when you're at the edge of the envelope?" one of the young crew members was asking. "Like the real edge, not the book edge." "The book edge is where the engineers stop being legally comfortable," Emily said. "The real edge is a conversation. The aircraft tells you. You have to learn to listen to it. Every aircraft talks differently. Some get loud, some get quiet. Some shimmy, some stiffen. You have to log a lot of time actually feeling the aircraft respond before you start to hear what it's saying." "What does the T-28 say?" the same kid asked. A pause. "Honestly, she gets very still right before she decides you've asked too much of her. It's almost like she holds her breath. That's when you know you're at the actual edge. Most people never feel it because they've never pushed far enough to find it." Another pause. "I've found it a few times," Emily said, and there was something in her voice, then a weight like words with something heavy underneath them that made Ryan standing outside the door go completely still. A few times. Not once. Not twice. A few times. That meant she had taken that aircraft to the absolute limit of what it could survive more than once and come back. He stood outside that door for a long moment. Then he walked away and he told himself he wasn't thinking about it, and he spent the rest of that evening being louder and more confident than usual with everyone around him, which was what Ryan Mitchell did when something had genuinely unsettled him. That night, he sat at his desk in his quarters and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He searched. He searched for Emily Carter. Civilian pilot licenses, airshow records, competition results, instructor, credentials, anything public. He found almost nothing. A brief listing in an airshow program from 6 years ago. A mention in a regional aviation newsletter. A photograph, distant grainy, of a woman standing next to a small aircraft at what appeared to be a rural airfield. That was it? For a pilot who had apparently attracted the personal attention of the Office of the Air Force Chief of Staff Emily Carter, had almost no public existence. He told himself this meant nothing. He went to sleep. He did not sleep well. The morning of the air show arrived with perfect desert weather, clear skylight. Wind, the kind of day that makes the Nevada high desert look like the surface of a dream. The base had been groomed and polished for the event. Grandstands were full by 9 a.m. The announcer's booth crackled with sound checks. Ground crews moved with the specific, focused energy of people who had trained for exactly this. The pilot lineup was strong. Ryan's formation team went in the morning slot and executed cleanly, 6 aircraft moving through the Nevada sky with the precision of a single thought expressed by 6 separate bodies. The crowd responded exactly the way the crowd always responded to a well-executed formation, run with the particular silence of people watching, something that costs a significant amount to get wrong. And then when the aircraft landed and the pilots climbed down with sustained and sincere applause. Ryan landed feeling the warm certainty of a job done very well. He checked the schedule. Emily Carter, 2 p.m., T-28 Trojan, civilian demonstration. He had 2 hours. He spent them telling himself he wasn't thinking about her. He watched from the pilot's ready area when she walked out to the flight line at 1:45. She was wearing her worn flight suit now, a plain, no insignia suit that was clearly custom to her measurements, but showed no affiliation to any unit or branch. She carried her old battered helmet under her arm. She walked the same way she always walked, quietly, economically, with no performance in it. Sergeant Reyes met her at the aircraft, and the two of them exchanged a few words. Reyes nodded, checked something on the aircraft, nodded again. He stepped back. Emily put on her helmet. She climbed into the cockpit. And the T-28's engine, that old piston-driven engine that sounded like the distant past, had started its car and was warming it up, turned over and caught and settled into the deep, rhythmic growl that was the signature sound of that era of aviation. Ryan watched. The aircraft lined up at the end of the runway. The announcer said something about a civilian demonstration pilot showcasing vintage aviation techniques. A few people in the grandstands glanced over with the mild interest of spectators, taking a moment to check their phones between the real attractions. The T-28 began its takeoff roll. And then Ryan Mitchell, who had flown faster and higher than any aircraft in that lineup, who had more hours in the sky than almost anyone there, who had been flying since he was 16 years old, saw something in the first 20 seconds of Emily Carter's takeoff roll that made him take one slow step forward toward the flight line fence. Because the way she accelerated was wrong. Not wrong as in dangerous. Wrong as in unlike anything a standard demonstration pilot would do. The T-28 was not a fast aircraft. Its top speed was roughly 300 miles per hour at high altitude, about a third of what Ryan's jet could do. But in those first 20 seconds, the way Emily managed the torque, the way she held the aircraft perfectly coordinated against the left-pulling tendency of the engine, the precision of the control inputs she was making. Ryan could see it, even from the ground, could read it in the aircraft's movement, the way you learn to read the motion of any machine you've spent thousands of hours understanding. She wasn't flying the aircraft. She was wearing it. There is a difference, and every experienced pilot knows it. 90% of pilots, good pilots, qualified pilots, professional pilots, fly their aircraft. They input commands and the aircraft responds, and the relationship between the pilot and the machine is that of a competent operator and a tool. This is fine. This is safe. This is how aviation is supposed to work. The other 10%, the very small fraction who have reached something beyond technical proficiency into an almost physical integration with the machine where the aircraft. The relationship becomes something different, something harder to describe. The aircraft stops being a separate thing and starts being an extension of the body and the inputs. Stop being commands and start being something closer to intention. And the result is a kind of flight that looks from the ground qualitatively different. Ryan was in that 10%. He recognized it immediately in someone else. The T-28 lifted off the runway and the crowd began its standard polite applause for the vintage aircraft. And Ryan stood at the fence with his hands wrapped around the chain link and his entire attention locked on the sky. Because Emily Carter had just taken that old propeller trainer into a banking climb at an angle that should not have been possible for that aircraft at that weight and that speed, and she had done it with a smoothness that erased any sense of effort, any suggestion that what she was doing required more than a casual thought. Next to him, he heard a voice. "Oh," said Jason Miller quietly. Ryan looked at him. Miller was watching the aircraft with an expression Ryan had never seen on Miller's face before. Miller was not a dramatic person. Miller was the steadiest, most even-tempered pilot on the base. But his face right now had the look of a man who has just seen something recalibrate everything he thought he knew about the possible. "What?" Ryan said. "Watch what she does coming out of the climb," Miller said. "Watch the recovery." Ryan looked back at the sky. The T-28 crested its climb and transitioned, and in the transition, Emily did something that both Ryan and Miller recognized as a technique, and neither of them could immediately name, because it was a recovery sequence that was not in any standard training manual, and it was executed at an altitude that gave almost no margin for error, and it was done with a precision that made it look effortless, and it was categorically, unambiguously, the product of experience that went somewhere most pilots never went. "Where did she learn that?" Ryan said. He wasn't asking Miller. He was asking the sky. The sky through the voice of the T-28's engine offered no answer. But the aircraft kept moving, and the crowd, which had been offering polite applause, went quieter. Not quieter in the way crowds go quiet when they're bored. Quieter in the way crowds go quiet when they're watching something and their bodies have outrun their minds, and they are focused in a way they don't fully understand yet. And Ryan Mitchell, standing at the fence, his hands still on the chain link, his jaw set, his eyes tracking every movement of that old propeller aircraft across the Nevada sky, felt something happen in his chest that he did not have an immediate word for. It was not admiration exactly. It was the specific and uncomfortable sensation of understanding that you have been wrong about something important and that the wrongness had been visible from the beginning to everyone except you, and that the person you had dismissed was capable of things you could not dismiss, no matter how badly you might want to. The T-28 climbed and turned and recovered, and the crowd at Redstone Valley Air Base went very quiet. And Ryan Mitchell stood at the fence and watched. And somewhere in the back of his mind, behind all the certainty and their reputation in the 27 years of absolute confidence, something small and essential cracked open. He didn't know what it was yet. He would figure it out later. For now, he just watched the sky. And the woman in the old propeller plane moved through it like she had been born there, like she belonged to it in a way that went deeper than training. Like she had learned what she knew in places where the cost of learning wrong was something none of them would ever want to pay. The T-28 rolled into its next sequence and the crowd leaned forward, and the desert sky over Nevada was full of something that nobody on that base had a name for yet. But they were all beginning to feel it. Every single one of them. The performance was only halfway done. The T-28 landed. And for 3 full seconds, nobody at Redstone Valley Air Base made a single sound. Not the crowd in the grandstands, not the ground crew standing at the edge of the tarmac, not the announcer whose job was literally to fill silence with words, and who was at this particular moment sitting in his booth with his microphone in his hand and absolutely nothing coming out of his mouth. 3 seconds of total silence across an air base that housed 2,000 people and had never in 9 years of air shows gone quiet like this. Then the grandstands erupted. Not the polite, appreciative applause of an audience watching a vintage aircraft demonstration. Not the kind of clapping people do when something is charming or nostalgic or well executed within expectations. This was the other kind, the kind that starts before people have consciously decided to clap, the kind that comes from the body before the mind has caught up, raw and surprised and genuine in a way that manufactured spectacle never quite achieves. Ryan Mitchell heard it from the pilot staging area. He did not move. He was still standing where he had been standing for the last 18 minutes, his hands no longer on the chain link fence. He had let go at some point during the performance without noticing his arms at his sides, his eyes on the runway where the T-28 was rolling to a stop. Jason Miller appeared beside him. "You doing okay?" Miller asked. "I'm fine," Ryan said. "You haven't moved in about 15 minutes. "I said I'm fine, Jason." Miller looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the runway. "She did the Pugachev Cobra sequence," he said, "in a T-28. Do you understand what I'm saying? The Pugachev Cobra, in a propeller aircraft that was designed in 1949. Ryan understood exactly what Miller was saying. The Pugachev Cobra was a maneuver that modern high-performance fighter jets could barely execute, a sudden extreme pitch-up that brought the aircraft to near vertical bleeding speed to almost nothing before recovering forward flight. It was a weapons evasion technique developed for jets with thrust-to-weight ratios that defied physics. It was not supposed to be possible in a piston-engine trainer aircraft. She modified it, Ryan said, because his mind needed to find a technical explanation and hold on to it. It wasn't the full sequence. She adapted it for the aircraft's Ryan. Miller's voice was quiet and patient. She did it at 400 feet above the ground, in a 40-year-old training aircraft, with an engine that produces a fraction of the thrust required for that maneuver. And she made it look like she was parking a car. Ryan said nothing. Down on the flight line, the T-28 had stopped. The engine had cut. Emily Carter was climbing out of the cockpit, and Sergeant Reyes was there to meet her. And Ryan could see from here that Reyes was talking fast and gesturing, which was something Reyes almost never did. Ryan began walking toward the flight line. He didn't make a decision to do it. His legs simply started moving. He reached the T-28 as Emily was pulling off her helmet. Her hair was damp at the temples. She looked, Ryan thought, exactly the same as she had looked before the flight, composed, unremarkable, unhurried, like she had just driven to the grocery store and come back. Reyes saw Ryan approaching and stopped talking mid-sentence. Emily turned. She looked at Ryan with an expression that was not quite neutral and not quite anything else he could name. Patient, maybe. The way someone looks when they have been expecting a conversation and are simply waiting for it to begin. Ryan stopped in front of her. He had approximately 16 things he wanted to say and no idea which one to start with. What came out was, "Where did you learn the Cobra sequence?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "You recognized it." "Of course I recognized it. Every pilot on this base recognized it. Nobody on this base understands how you did it in that aircraft." She looked at the T-28 for a moment, then back at Ryan. "The Cobra is about energy management," she said. "It's not about thrust. People think it's about thrust because jets use thrust to execute it. But the principle is about understanding exactly where your aircraft is in the energy curve at every moment of the maneuver. If you know the aircraft well enough to feel the curve, the thrust is almost secondary. That's not, you can't just," Ryan stopped, took a breath, started again. "The margins on that sequence at that altitude in that aircraft are essentially zero. You have no room to correct. If anything goes fractionally wrong, then you don't let anything go fractionally wrong," Emily said simply. The simplicity of it hit Ryan like a door swinging open unexpectedly. Not arrogance, not bravado, just a statement of fact from someone who had lived inside those margins long enough to understand them as home. "Who are you?" Ryan asked. And this time he wasn't asking it the way he had asked questions before, with the edge of dismissal, underneath the implicit assumption that the answer wouldn't matter much. He was asking it the way you ask a question when you genuinely don't know the answer and have begun to understand that the answer is important. Emily held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'm the pilot in slot 2. Is there something specific you needed, Captain?" She picked up her helmet. She walked toward the maintenance hangar. Ryan watched her go. Behind him, Reyes said quietly, "She corrected my pre-flight fuel trim before she got in. Said the mixture was running 2% lean for altitude. She was right. I've been doing fuel trim on these old birds for 16 years, and she spotted it in about 45 seconds. Ryan turned to look at him. Reyes shrugged, but it was not a dismissive shrug. It was the shrug of a man recalibrating. "I don't know who she is either, sir, but I'm starting to think it might matter." The crowd was still buzzing when Ryan made his way back to the pilot staging area. He could hear fragments of conversation from the spectator area civilians trying to articulate what they had just seen using words like unbelievable and impossible. And did you see that while the professional pilots who had watched from the flight line said almost nothing to each other, which was its own kind of statement? Major Holt found Ryan near the briefing tent. Captain Mitchell, Holt said, his voice carrying its usual careful flatness. Debrief in 30 minutes. Full show roster. Yes, sir. Holt started to walk away. Ryan said, Major. Holt stopped. Her approval, Ryan said. The Office of the Chief of Staff. That kind of approval doesn't go to civilian demonstration pilots. That kind of approval goes to people who are operationally significant in some way that isn't being disclosed. Holt looked at him for a long moment. 30 minutes, Captain, he said, and walked away. The debrief should have been about the formation run. It should have been about Ryan's team, the clean execution, the crowd response, the things that worked, and the minor technical corrections for day 2. These were the conversations that filled post-show debriefs at Redstone Valley Professional Technical Forward-Looking. Instead, the debrief spent the first 12 minutes talking about Emily Carter. Not about her in a directed way. Nobody stood up and said, let's discuss the civilian pilot. It was more organic than that, which made it more revealing. Pilots who had been at the flight line started describing what they had seen. Others who had watched from the grandstands added details. The descriptions accumulated into something that sounded taken together less like an air show demonstration and more like a combat qualification review. The low-altitude recovery on the third pass, said a pilot named Torres who flew test aircraft and had seen more unusual flight profiles than most. She went inverted at 200 feet, 250, 210, said Miller, who had apparently been paying close enough attention to have a number. I checked it against the field elevation markers afterward. A brief silence fell over the room. 210 feet, inverted, in a 40-year-old propeller aircraft. The margins on that, Torres said slowly, are not margins I would accept in a modern aircraft with a current avionics suite and a 0-0 ejection seat. He paused. In a T-28 with a conventional chute, those are not margins. That's just, he stopped. Nobody finished the sentence for him because there was no comfortable way to finish it. Ryan had been sitting in the back of the room through all of this listening, saying nothing. Now he leaned forward in his chair. Has anyone pulled her background, he asked. Flight records, licensing, anything. I did, said a young intelligence officer named Carver, who had the slightly abashed expression of someone who had done something in a gray area and was now deciding whether to own it. Last night, Civil Aviation Licensing Contest Records, Exhibition, Permits, Instructor, Certifications, everything public. And almost nothing. She has a current air show exhibition permit. She has a Class 3 medical. She has about 4 paragraphs of traceable professional history over the last 12 years. And every one of those paragraphs leads to a door that's either locked or doesn't exist in public record. Carver paused. Whatever she did before civilian air shows, she did it somewhere that doesn't have a public file. The room absorbed this. That's a military profile, Torres said quietly. A career that doesn't have a public file. That's what that looks like. Ryan looked at Holt, who was standing at the front of the room with the expression of a man who was weighing how much information his current orders permitted him to share. Major, Ryan said, the debrief is about today's show performance, Holt said. Captain Mitchell, your formation team, let's talk about the eastern approach on the second pass. Ryan held his gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he looked down at his notes. The debrief moved on. But something had shifted in that room and everyone in it could feel it, the specific and uncomfortable awareness that there was more happening at Redstone Valley Air Base than the annual air show, and that the woman with the old truck and the battered flight helmet was at the center of it. That night, Ryan could not sleep. This was not unusual for him. Before a show day, adrenaline and preparation tended to run long in his system, but tonight the wakefulness was different. It was not the clean, focused energy of pre-performance readiness. It was something more restless than that, more searching. He sat at his desk with his laptop and went back to looking. He searched differently this time. Not for Emily Carter, the civilian pilot. He went broader, stranger, less direct. He searched for unusual classified mission designations that had been partially declassified in the last 5 years. He searched for documented female combat aviators in black operations programs. He searched for T-28 usage in non-standard military training programs. He spent an hour going sideways through declassified document summaries from programs that had been closed out in the last decade. At 11:47 p.m., he found a sentence, just one sentence in a heavily redacted after-action summary from a program that had been officially decommissioned 80 years ago. Most of the document was black bars, names, dates, locations, mission parameters, and all redacted. But one sentence had survived the redaction intact, apparently by oversight, because it was part of a technical conclusion rather than an operational detail, and the redactor had missed it. The sentence read, "Mission recovery was achieved through non-standard approach executed by call sign Ghost Rider, whose aircraft performance during extraction exceeded documented envelope parameters for the platform by a factor estimated between 1.4 and 1.7. Ryan read it 3 times. Ghost Rider. He searched the call sign. He found nothing. Direct call signs from classified programs were not the kind of thing that survived into searchable public record. But he found 2 indirect references, both in heavily redacted documents from different programs, both citing a call sign rather than a name, and both describing flight performance in language that sounded less like military documentation and more like someone trying to put into official words something they had witnessed and couldn't entirely believe. Exceeded documented envelope parameters. Non-standard approach. Achieved mission objectives under conditions that precluded standard operational response. He sat with this for a long time. Then he closed the laptop and lay down on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the T-28 at 210 feet inverted. He thought about the way Emily had said a few times when talking about finding the edge of the aircraft's envelope. I thought about the specific quality of her silence when she walked away from his questions. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. The silence of someone who had too much to say and had learned through a long and specific kind of experience not to say it. He fell asleep sometime after 1 a.m., and at 5:58 a.m. he was woken by his phone. It was Miller. "Get to the operations center," Miller said. "Right now, don't stop for coffee." Ryan was out of his bunk and into his uniform in under 90 seconds. He had the door open before the adrenaline had fully resolved into coherent thought. "What happened?" he said into the phone. "Test program, hangar," Miller said. "Prototype aircraft. It's airborne and it shouldn't be." Ryan ran. The classified test program facility at Redstone Valley was a separate compound within the base, access restricted even to most of the personnel stationed there. Ryan had been inside twice in his career, both times for briefings on next-generation avionics systems. He knew what was hangared there, or at least he knew the general category. Prototype combat aircraft, systems that existed between classified development and operational deployment. Machines that were extraordinary and unproven, and in some configurations genuinely dangerous to fly. One of those machines was currently in the air. Ryan reached the operations center to find controlled chaos, the specific and alarming variety of chaos that occurs when trained professionals are confronting a situation their training has not fully prepared them for. 3 flight engineers were at their station's headsets on, talking fast and low. Major Holt was standing behind them with his arms crossed so tightly his knuckles were white. 2 men in civilian clothes who had not been part of the airshow roster were standing near the back wall, and Ryan identified them immediately from posture and expression as program officials, the people whose career existed inside this specific aircraft. And in the corner of the operations center, standing with her arms crossed and her eyes on the tracking displays, was Emily Carter. She was still in the clothes she slept in, which meant she had been called or had come on her own even faster than Ryan. Her hair was loose. She had her flight helmet in one hand hanging at her side, which was a detail Ryan noticed and filed immediately because it meant she was ready to fly if she had to. Ryan crossed to Miller, who was near the central display. "Talk to me." "Test pilot took the prototype up for an unauthorized pre-dawn check flight," Miller said rapidly. "Solo unscheduled, no clearance. Aircraft is Captain Webb, you know." Webb, Ryan knew Webb, 32 years old. Brilliant, one of the most gifted test pilots on the base, also known for pushing at boundaries in ways that occasionally alarmed the people responsible for keeping him and the aircraft alive. Webb took it up, started running performance checks outside the approved envelope, and now he's got a cascading flight control failure. The fly-by-wire system is in a degraded mode. The engineers haven't seen an actual flight before they've seen it in simulation, but the sim parameters and the actual aircraft behavior are not matching. What's his altitude? 12,000. He's holding altitude, but his pitch authority is compromised. He's got roll control, but it's inconsistent. He has engine power, but if he tries to reduce for landing, the fly-by-wire degradation may interact with the thrust reduction in a way that... Miller stopped, looked at Ryan. In the sim, that interaction caused unrecoverable pitch down into the ground. What are the engineers telling him? They're running through recovery procedures. Standard degraded mode protocol. Webb is following them. The aircraft is not responding the way it should. Ryan turned to look at the tracking display. The prototype was visible as a data tag moving in slow, careful circles northeast of the base. The instinctive behavior of a pilot who knows something is wrong and is buying time by staying airborne while the people on the ground figure out the answer. He looked at Emily. She was looking at the displays the way she had looked at the topographic maps on the engine cowling 2 mornings ago, with total focus taking in data, cross-referencing it against something internal. Ryan walked over to her. "You know this aircraft," he said. It was not a question. Emily didn't look at him. "I know the platform family," she said. "I've seen a degraded fly-by-wire failure mode similar to this one. Not identical, similar. In simulation, no." The word landed in the space between them. "What happened?" Ryan asked. "The pilot made it back," Emily said. "The procedure the engineers are using right now is not going to work. They're addressing the fly-by-wire degradation as an isolated system failure. It's not isolated. The degradation is interacting with the aircraft's stability augmentation. They're fighting 2 systems that are fighting each other. The more Webb follows standard protocol, the more he's making both failures worse." Ryan stared at her. "You need to tell the engineers that." "I already did." Ryan looked at the engineers. They were still running their protocol, still talking to Webb through the headsets. "They didn't believe you," Ryan said. Emily's jaw tightened slightly. It was the first genuine emotion he had seen cross her face since she arrived at Redstone Valley. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. The particular expression of someone who has been disbelieved at exactly the wrong moment before and knows what comes next if it happens again. "They don't know who I am," she said, "and right now they don't have time to find out." Ryan made a decision in approximately 1 second. He crossed the room to the chief flight engineer, a man named Okafor, who had 15 years on this specific platform family and was currently talking into his headset with the tight, controlled voice of someone who was afraid but had decided not to show it. "Okafor," Ryan said. "I'm working, Captain. The civilian woman in the corner. Listen to what she's telling you about the stability augmentation interaction." "Captain, I have a pilot in a degraded..." "I know you do. Listen to her first. 20 seconds, then decide." Okafor looked at him. Ryan held his gaze. Something passed between them, not authority exactly, but something more direct than that, conviction. The kind of conviction that is visible in a person's face when they are not performing certainty, but actually feeling it. Okafor pulled his headset down. 20 seconds, he said. Emily was already there. She didn't run. She moved fast and with purpose, and she started talking before she was fully stopped. "Your stability augmentation is compensating for the fly-by-wire degradation by continuously adjusting trim. Every time your protocol tells Webb to make a control input, the augmentation is reading that input as a disturbance and countering it. They are in a feedback loop. The longer it runs, the smaller his effective control authority gets. At the current rate of authority reduction, he has approximately 11 minutes before his pitch authority is insufficient for a landing approach." Okafor stared at her. "If that's true, the protocol will not work. You need Webb to stop making control inputs. Full stop. Let the aircraft find its own equilibrium. It will feel wrong to him. It will feel like he's doing nothing while the aircraft is failing. But the stability augmentation will stop fighting him the moment he stops giving it something to fight." Okafor's face was doing complicated things. Ryan watched him wrestle with it, the engineering instinct to trust the system, the professional instinct to trust his own expertise in something new. Some element introduced by the absolute quality of Emily's certainty, which was not the certainty of someone making an educated guess. "How do you know this?" Okafor said. Emily said, "Because I've been in that cockpit." 4 words. Okafor made his decision. He got back on the headset. "Webb, this is Okafor. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to go hands off. Do not touch the controls. I know what I'm asking, hands completely off. Let the aircraft settle. Through the operations center speakers, Webb's voice came back strained and tight. Okafor, my pitch is degraded. I cannot go hands off. Webb, trust me, hands off right now. A long pause. The tracking display showed the aircraft's movement changing, the careful circles becoming briefly erratic as Webb processed the instruction, and then visibly gradually steadying. The room was absolutely silent. 30 seconds, 45. Okafor, Webb's voice had changed. The tightness was still there, but underneath it was something else, the beginning of disbelief of a different kind. The oscillation is its damping. My pitch authority is coming back. Okafor exhaled. It was the only sound in the operations center. Understood, Webb. Hold altitude. We're going to walk you through the landing approach step by step. You're going to be fine. Ryan turned to look at Emily. She was still standing where she had been standing, her helmet in her hand, watching the tracking display. Her expression had not changed. There was no triumph in it, no relief of the visible kind, no satisfaction, just the focused attention of someone whose job was not finished yet and who knew it. Okafor pulled his headset down and turned to face her. Who are you? He said. His voice had stripped down to something unguarded, the professional armor gone for just this moment. Emily said, someone who needed to be here. And then she turned and walked to the window and watched the sky above the northern end of the base, where a prototype aircraft that should have been a catastrophe was beginning slowly and carefully to come home. Ryan watched her watch the sky. And standing there in the operations center, surrounded by people who were breathing again after 11 minutes of not fully breathing, Ryan felt the thing he had been reaching towards since he first watched her fly finally solidify into something he could name. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't professional respect. Though it was that too, it was recognition, the specific and humbling recognition of a person who has spent his entire career believing he is exceptional, encountering someone for whom what he considers exceptional is simply Tuesday. Miller appeared at his shoulder. You want to hear something interesting? Miller said, his voice low. I'm not sure I can handle more interesting right now, Ryan said honestly. Too bad. I was looking at the T-28 while everyone was focused on the operations center. On the right side of the fuselage underneath the wing root, there's a marking that's partially painted over. Old paint years, old paint. But the primer underneath is dark, and you can see the shape under the wrong angle of light. Miller paused. 2 words, Ryan. I could barely make them out, but I could read them. Ryan looked at him. Miller held his gaze. Ghost Rider, Miller said. The operations center buzzed around them. Okafor was talking Webb through landing approach. The program officials near the back wall were on their phones. The engineers were running recovery calculations. And Ryan Mitchell stood very still and felt 12 hours of confusion and dismissal, and recalibration and dawning understanding arrive at their destination all at once, like a fist closing around a single clear, undeniable fact. Ghost Rider. He looked at Emily Carter, who was still at the window, still watching the sky, still holding her battered flight helmet loosely at her side. And Ryan Mitchell, who had never in 27 years of breathing flight lacked a word for what he was feeling, found himself standing in complete and utter silence. Because of the call signed from the redacted document, the pilot, who had exceeded documented envelope parameters by a factor of 1.4 to 1.7, who had executed a non-standard approach under conditions that precluded standard operational response, who had brought people home from places the official record could not describe, that pilot was standing 8 feet away from him, had been standing 8 feet away from him for 3 days. While he laughed, while he pointed at her aircraft and made his joke, while he told his fellow pilots that someone upstairs had lost their mind. The prototype touched down on the runway outside. The operations center erupted in the collective exhale of 24 people who had been bracing for something much worse. And Emily Carter watched it land and said nothing, and her face was calm, and her hands were steady, and she was exactly who she had been every single moment since she drove into Redstone Valley Air Base in a truck with electrical tape on the mirror. She had not changed. Everything around her had. The prototype was down. Webb was alive. And for approximately 4 minutes after the wheels touched the runway, Redstone Valley Air Base existed in that specific suspended state that follows a near disaster, the collective inhale of an institution that has just understood how close it came to something it could not walk back from. Then the 4 minutes ended, and the institution remembered how to be an institution again, and everything started moving very fast. Major Holt was the first person to regain full operational function. That was what made him good at his job, not brilliance, not charisma, but the ability to return to clarity faster than anyone else in the room when the crisis had passed. He started issuing instructions before the prototype had fully cleared the runway. Ground crews, medical standby for Webb, engineering team to begin immediate post-incident documentation, program officials to a separate briefing room. All of it delivered in a voice that was level and quiet and left no room for discussion. Then he turned to Emily. "Miss Carter," he said, "my office now." Emily set her helmet on the nearest flat surface and followed him. Ryan took 2 steps after them before Holt stopped with Ord turning around and said, "Not you, Captain Mitchell." Ryan stopped. He stood in the middle of the operations center while the room reorganized itself around the aftermath, and he watched the door close behind Holt and Emily, and he felt for the first time in a career built on being at the center of everything important, genuinely completely outside. Miller was beside him again. Miller had been beside him more in the last 24 hours than in the previous 6 months combined, which Ryan was beginning to understand was not coincidence. Miller had been watching all of this longer than Ryan had. Miller had seen it coming before Ryan was willing to look. "Ghost Rider," Ryan said, just the 2 words said quietly into the middle distance. "I know," Miller said. "Why is she here, Jason? Not for the air show. She was never here for the air show." Miller was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Think about what happened this morning. A prototype aircraft with a failure mode the engineers couldn't resolve. A classified test program, and a woman who has flown something close enough to that aircraft in a situation close enough to that failure that she could walk in and solve the problem in under 2 minutes." He paused. "She wasn't invited to put on a show for the spectators, Ryan. She was invited because someone very senior knew that aircraft was going to have problems, and they wanted someone in that base who could handle it when it did." Ryan turned to look at him. "You're saying the air show was cover. I'm saying the air show was her reason for being here. What she actually came here to do was something else." Ryan thought about the topographic maps on the engine cowling. He thought about the 2 hours of inspection on the T-28. He thought about the way she had stood watching the other pilots' practice runs. Not learning from them, he understood now, but assessing the base, the people, the operational environment. The way any experienced operative would assess a new location before the thing they came to do actually happened. I thought about the stress fracture in the engine mount that 3 certified maintenance inspectors had missed. She had found that fracture in 45 minutes. Not because she was checking a box, because she was checking everything the way you check everything when you are in a place where the details matter and you cannot afford to miss one. "She's been operational this whole time," Ryan said. "Yeah," Miller said, "I think she has." At 7:42 a.m., Captain Webb came through the operations center on his way to the medical bay, flanked by 2 flight surgeons who were taking his blood pressure and asking him questions he was clearly struggling to answer with the appropriate degree of calm. He was 32 years old and had the shaken, overbright look of a man who has just had a very direct conversation with his own mortality and is still processing the vocabulary. He stopped when he saw Ryan. "The engineers tell me a civilian talked them through my recovery," Webb said. "She did," Ryan said. "Who is she?" "I'm working on that." Webb looked at him for a moment. His hands, Ryan noticed, were not entirely steady. "She told Okafor to tell me to go hands off. You know what that feels like in a degraded fly-by-wire aircraft at 12,000 feet, when your pitch authority is already compromised and someone on the ground tells you to take your hands off the controls." He shook his head slowly. "It feels like being asked to step off a building and trust that the ground is closer than you think. I almost didn't do it." "But you did," Ryan said, "because Okafor's voice told me he believed it. And Okafor doesn't believe things he hasn't verified." Webb's jaw tightened. "Find out who she is, Ryan. I want to know the name of the person who kept me out of a crater." He moved on toward the medical bay. Ryan stood where he was and thought about what Webb had said. Hands off, in a degraded aircraft. At 12,000 feet, trust that the person on the ground knows something you don't and act on that trust completely and bet your life on it. That was what Webb had done. That was what Emily had asked him to do. And she had been right. Ryan had asked her where she learned the Cobra sequence, and she had said simply in a place where being wrong once meant no second chance. He hadn't understood what she meant at the time. He understood it now with a clarity that sat uncomfortably in his chest, because the kind of certainty Emily had demonstrated in that operations center did not come from textbooks or simulations or carefully supervised training programs. It came from having actually been there, from having been the person in the degraded aircraft, from having been at 12,000 feet with compromised controls and no good options, and having found a way through it and having carried that knowledge forward in her body ever since. A few times she had said, he had counted them now, the moments in the last 3 days where she had revealed the edges of what she knew, and every single one of them pointed to the same conclusion. This was not a person who had learned about the limits of flight. This was a person who had lived past them more than once and come back and kept going. Holt's office door opened at 8:15. Emily came out first. Her expression was the same as it always was, composed, unrevealing, carrying no signal about what had happened in the room behind her. She retrieved her helmet from where she had set it, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the hangar. Ryan intercepted her. "Emily," he said. She stopped. She turned. There was something slightly different in the way she looked at him this time, though he couldn't immediately identify what it was. Less waiting, maybe. Less bracing. "Webb wants to know your name," Ryan said. "He knows my name," Emily said. "It's on the roster. He wants to know who you actually are." A pause. "Tell him I'm the pilot who told him to let go," Emily said. "That's enough." She started to move again. "The marking on the T-28, Ryan said. She stopped again. "Ghost Rider," he said. "Miller found it under the wing root, painted over but visible at the right angle." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, at least not for Emily. She stood with the silence the way she stood with everything else, without fighting it. Then she said, "You've been doing your research." "I found a sentence in a declassified after-action summary," Ryan said. One sentence about a pilot who exceeded documented envelope parameters by a factor of 1.4 to 1.7, who executed a non-standard approach under conditions that precluded standard procedure. He watched her face. "That was you." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "That document is supposed to be fully redacted," she said. "One sentence survived," Ryan said. The redactor missed it. Something moved across Emily's face, not alarm, but something thoughtful. Filing the information, then she said, "What do you want to know, Captain Mitchell?" And Ryan, who had been asking variations of this question since she arrived, finally understood what he was actually asking. Not the facts of her career, not the specifics of missions he didn't have clearance for and probably never would. What he wanted to know was something simpler and more honest than any of that. "I want to know how you got there," he said, "to the kind of pilot you are. Not the missions, not the classified pieces. How you got there." Emily studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Walk with me." They walked to the far end of the flight line, where the T-28 sat in the early morning light, away from the operations center and the debrief rooms and the organized machinery of the base's response to what had just happened. Emily stopped near the aircraft's nose and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you know very well and have complicated feelings about. "I started flying at 17, she said. "My father was a crop duster. Not military, not glamorous. He flew the same 50-mile circuit every growing season for 23 years, and he took me up for the first time when I was 6, and I never stopped wanting to be in the air after that." She paused. "I got my private license at 17, commercial at 19, started instructing at 21 because I needed money and because teaching people to fly meant I got to fly more hours. I wasn't military. I wasn't connected. I was a girl from rural Kansas who could fly. And at 22 years old, that combination of facts did not open a lot of doors." Ryan said nothing. He was listening in the careful way he had not been capable of listening 3 days ago. "The Air Force had a program," Emily continued, "unofficial, experimental. They were looking for pilots who had developed outside the standard pipeline, no formal military training, no institutional habits. People who had learned to fly in conditions where the aircraft was old and the margins were small and the support structure was minimal. They wanted to know if that background produced something they couldn't get from inside the system." She looked at the T-28. "I got a letter, no official letterhead, just a post office box and a time and a location. I almost didn't go." "But you did," Ryan said. "I did." A pause. "The assessment was 3 weeks. They put us in old aircraft, not this old, but old, and they gave us scenarios, not simulations, Actual aircraft, actual conditions, consequences that were real. She was quiet for a moment. I was the only woman in the first cohort. I was also the only person from the first cohort who made it through all 3 weeks. Ryan felt the weight of that settle. What happened to the others? Some washed out on performance. Some chose to leave. One crashed. Her voice didn't change when she said it, but something in the air around the words was heavy. He was one of the best pilots in the cohort. He pushed past his actual limit by trying to match what he thought the program expected. That was the first thing I learned in that program that I hadn't known before. She looked at Ryan directly. Knowing your actual limit is not the same as knowing the limit. A lot of very talented pilots confuse confidence for capability. They push to where they believe they can go, not to where they have tested that they can go. The distance between those two things at the wrong moment is everything. Ryan heard this differently than he would have heard it 48 hours ago. He heard it as a statement about himself because he understood standing here that it was one, not cruelly meant, just precisely accurate in the way Emily Carter said most things. After the assessment, he asked, after the assessment, I flew for the program for 6 years. I can't describe the specific operations. Most of what I can tell you is that the aircraft were always old, the conditions were always difficult, and the missions were always the kind where you couldn't call for backup because the backup didn't officially exist. She said this without drama, without the performed modesty of someone who knows they are impressive and in managing the impression. Just fact. I flew things I can't talk about in places I can't name. I brought people home. Some of the time, not always. And when the program was decommissioned 8 years ago, I went back to civilian aviation because there was nowhere else obvious to go. Ryan said, and Ghost Rider? Emily was quiet for a moment. Call signs are not names, she said finally. They're what the mission sees. Ghost Rider was what I was when I was in those places. Emily Carter is who I am the rest of the time. She glanced at him. Most people never have to figure out the difference. That's a good life if you can manage it. Ryan stood with that for a moment. Then he said something that cost him more than anything he had said in this conversation, or possibly in the last several years. I owe you an apology, a real one, not the polite kind. Emily looked at him. I treated you like you were beneath the show, he said. I said things out loud in front of people that I cannot take back. And I did it because of how you arrived and what you were flying, and the fact that you didn't look the way I thought a serious pilot was supposed to look. He stopped. That was wrong. It was disrespectful. And after what I've seen in the last 2 days, I understand that I was not just wrong about you specifically. I was wrong about something more fundamental than that. Emily held his gaze. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone deciding whether to accept an apology. It was the silence of someone hearing it, actually hearing it, and taking it at face value. I've heard worse, she said finally. That's not the bar I want to clear, Ryan said. And something shifted in Emily's expression. Then the smallest thing barely visible, but Ryan was watching closely enough to catch it. Not a smile exactly. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile and had better posture. No, she said, I suppose it's not. The second day of the air show began at 10 a.m. and the base conducted it with the kind of determined normalcy that institutions deploy after a crisis. Everything proceeding on schedule, everything executed with precision, every person performing their role with perhaps slightly more intentionality than usual, as if the act of doing the ordinary things correctly was itself a response to how close the extraordinary had gotten. Webb had been cleared by the flight surgeon for observation, but grounded from flying, which he accepted with the particular quiet of a man who knows he is lucky and is spending some time with that knowledge. He sat in the spectator area in civilian clothes and watched the show with the attentiveness of someone who understands better than he did yesterday what it costs. Ryan flew in the afternoon formation slot and flew it well. The execution was clean, the crowd responded, and Ryan performed his role with full focus and no distraction, which was notable because under the surface of that focus, something had been quietly restructured in the last 24 hours and had not yet finished settling. He found Miller after the formation run. I need to ask you something, Ryan said. You've been asking me things for 2 days, Miller said mildly. This one is different. Ryan looked at him. Have I been that bad? Not about her. In general, about people, about pilots who don't look like what I expect. Miller took a moment with this, not performing consideration, actually considering which was Miller's way. You're one of the best pilots I've ever seen fly, Miller said. You know that. I've told you that, and I meant it. But you've been using that as a complete sentence when it's actually the beginning of a longer one. What's the rest of it? The rest of it is that best at something doesn't tell you everything worth knowing, Miller said. It tells you that you've worked hard and you have talent and you've gotten results. It doesn't tell you what someone else knows that you don't. And you've been acting like those two things are the same, which they're not. Ryan was quiet. She knew things you don't know, Miller continued steady and without accusation. Not because she's more talented, maybe because she flew older harder with less margin and less support for longer, in places where you don't get to carry the comfort of your reputation in with you. That produces a different kind of knowing, not better or worse, different. And you couldn't see it because she didn't arrive the way you expected knowledge to arrive. Ryan said, she arrived in a truck with electrical tape on the mirror. Yeah, Miller said, she did. The pause that followed was long enough to mean something. At 4:17 p.m., Okafor found Ryan at the pilot staging area. The chief flight engineer looked different than he had looked before 6 a.m. that morning. Not older exactly, but recalibrated in the way people get recalibrated when something has shifted their understanding of the possible. He was carrying a tablet, and he had the distracted, inward-focused expression of someone who has been running numbers and does not entirely like where the numbers are going. I need to show you something, Okafor said. I've been running the telemetry from Webb's aircraft this morning, reconstructing the failure sequence. And, Ryan said. Okafor turned the tablet around. Ryan looked at the data. He was not a flight systems engineer, but he could read telemetry well enough to follow the shape of what Okafor was showing him. The failure cascade was visible in the numbers the moment the fly-by-wire degraded the stability augmentation's response to it, and then the feedback loop that Emily had described. Two systems fighting each other while the pilot tried to follow procedures designed for each failure in isolation. She called it exactly, Okafor said. The interaction between the fly-by-wire degradation and the stability augmentation. The feedback loop, the authority reduction rate, the time window before the pitch authority dropped below approach minimums. She described it with a precision that I could not have matched without this telemetry data in front of me. He paused. And she did it in the dark from looking at tracking data and listening to the pilot's radio calls, without access to the aircraft's systems documentation, without knowing the specific configuration of this prototype. Ryan looked at him. She's flown something very close to this, Okafor said. The same failure mode or something operationally equivalent. She didn't reason through it this morning. She recognized it. There's a difference in the response time and the precision of the description. What she did in that operations center was recall, not analysis. She told me she couldn't describe the specific operations, Ryan said. I'm not asking about the operations, Okafor said. I'm a flight systems engineer. I'm telling you that what this woman knows about degraded fly-by-wire behavior in high-performance aircraft is not something you learn in any training program I'm aware of. You learn it by surviving the failure mode in an actual aircraft. He tapped the tablet. Someone put her in that situation, more than once based on the confidence of the recall. And she came back every time. He looked at Ryan. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've worked with test pilots and combat pilots and development pilots and people who have more hours in experimental aircraft than most people have in their entire careers. I have never met anyone who knew what she knew this morning. He took the tablet back. I wanted you to know that, he said, because you were there at the flight line yesterday when she landed. I saw your face. You were still trying to figure out what you were looking at. He paused. I figured you should have the data. He walked away. Ryan stood in the pilot staging area in the late afternoon light and held what Okafor had just told him. Not a person who had learned about failure modes. A person who had survived them. In real aircraft, in real conditions, in operations that had no public record and left no traceable career history. A person who had been put deliberately and repeatedly in the kind of situations where the system breaks and the textbook answer doesn't exist and the only resource available is what you carry inside you from the last time it happened. And she had come out the other side, every time, carrying something back. He found her at the T-28 at 5 p.m. She was doing her post-show inspection with the same methodical attention she had brought to the pre-show inspection 2 days ago. Same flashlight, Same open inspection panels, same quality of focus, total unperformed, completely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. Ryan sat down on a nearby equipment case without announcing himself. He didn't try to start a conversation. He just sat there and let her work, and after a few minutes, Emily said, without looking up from an inspection panel, "Panel, you talked to Okafor. He came to me." Ryan said, "He's a thorough man," Emily said. "Good engineer. He said you couldn't have described the failure mode that precisely without having experienced something equivalent." Emily didn't answer immediately. She checked something inside the panel, recorded something on her small notepad, closed the panel. "He's right," she said. "How many times?" Ryan asked. Emily moved to the next panel. "How many times what? How many times did you get put in that situation? The degraded aircraft, the failure mode with no good options." A pause. "Enough times that I stopped counting," Emily said. "Which is not because it stopped mattering. It's because at a certain point, counting becomes less useful than learning." Ryan thought about this. "Were you afraid every time?" Emily stopped. She lowered the flashlight. She turned to look at him, and for a moment her face was more open than he had seen. It not vulnerable exactly, but less armored, the way a person gets when they are answering a question they consider worth answering honestly. "Every single time," she said. "Anyone who tells you they weren't afraid in those moments is either lying or wasn't paying enough attention to understand how bad it was. But you went anyway." "Fear is information," Emily said. "It tells you that the situation is serious and that your body understands this. Using the information correctly is the skill. The fear doesn't go away. You just learn to do your job at the same time." She turned back to the inspection. Ryan sat with this for a long time. At 6:43 p.m. something happened that nobody had been anticipating. A vehicle arrived at the base entrance, a dark government SUV, the kind that appears without warning at military facilities when someone senior has decided that something requires their personal attention. It was waved through the security checkpoint and drove directly to the operations center, which meant the driver knew where they were going, which meant they had been briefed on the layout of Redstone Valley Air Base before they arrived. Sergeant Reyes saw it first. He came to find Ryan, who was still near the flight line, and said quietly, "Sir, vehicle just came through the main gate. DOD plates. 2 passengers, civilian clothes, but the way they're moving." "I know what that means," Ryan said. "They went to Holt's office." "Of course they did." Ryan went to find Miller. The two of them positioned themselves in the corridor near Holt's office in a way that was technically not surveillance. They had legitimate reasons to be in that corridor and waited. Holt's door opened 11 minutes later. One of the 2 visitors emerged, spoke briefly to a staff sergeant, and the staff sergeant turned and went toward the flight line, toward the T-28. Ryan and Miller looked at each other. Ryan moved. He reached the flight line 20 seconds before the staff sergeant, which gave him 20 seconds alone with Emily, who was closing the last inspection panel on the T-28, and looked up at Ryan's approaching footsteps with the calm attention of someone who had been expecting a conversation to arrive, just not necessarily tonight. "Someone just came through the main gate," Ryan said. "Government vehicle. They went to Holt, and now a staff sergeant is on his way to find you." Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the last panel, clicked the fasteners, and picked up her flight helmet. "How long?" she asked. 30 seconds, maybe less." Emily nodded. She held his gaze, and in that brief moment, something passed between them that Ryan could not have named, but understood the look of 2 people who have arrived after a difficult 3 days at a kind of mutual regard that neither of them had expected at the start. "Ryan," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed. "Whatever they tell you about why I was here," she said, "know that the air show was real. I wasn't performing for the crowd. I never perform." She paused. "The flying is always real. The rest is just context." The staff sergeant appeared at the edge of the flight line. "Miss Carter, Major Holt requests your presence in the operations building." Emily looked at Ryan for one more second. Then she turned and walked toward the operations building, and Ryan watched her go, and the desert evening light fell across the flight line, and the T-28 sat where she had left it, inspection complete, every panel closed and fastened, nothing left to chance. He looked at the aircraft for a long time after she was gone. Then he crouched down at the right side under the wing root and angled his head the way Miller had described. The old paint was pale over the primer. The light was wrong for it to diffuse the evening, coming in flat. He moved, shifted his angle, tried 3 different positions, and then he found the angle. 2 words, dark outlines under layers of paint that had been applied carefully, professionally, but not quite carefully enough for someone who was looking for them with the right knowledge and the right light and the right position. Ghostwriter. Ryan stayed crouched under the wing for a long time. Above him, the Nevada sky went from gold to orange to the deep bruised purple of a desert evening, and the base moved through its end-of-day rhythms around him. And somewhere in the operations building, a meeting was happening that he was not part of and would not be told about. But he stayed there anyway, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay with what you have just learned long enough to actually learn it. And Ryan Mitchell was, for the first time in a long time, in no hurry at all. The meeting in Holt's office lasted 47 minutes. Ryan knew because he timed it. He had gone back to the pilot staging area after crouching under the T-28's wing, and he had sat down at the long table where pilots reviewed their flight data after show runs. And he had looked at his watch at 6:51 p.m. when Emily walked into the operations building, and he had looked at it again at 7:38 p.m. when she came out. He knew she came out because Miller texted him one word: leaving. Ryan was out of the staging area in 4 seconds. He caught Emily at the edge of the parking area near the base of operations, where the government SUV was still parked with its engine running. She was walking toward it with her duffel bag over one shoulder and her flight helmet under her arm, and the 2 men from the vehicle were flanking her at a respectful distance, not escorting her exactly, but accompanying her in the way people accompany someone important when the situation requires it and protocol doesn't quite have a word for it. Emily, Ryan said. She stopped, turned. The 2 men stopped as well, and one of them began to say something. And Emily raised one hand slightly, not dramatically, just a small, precise gesture. And the man stopped saying whatever he had been starting to say. That small gesture told Ryan more about who Emily Carter was in certain rooms than anything he had seen in 3 days. "You're leaving," Ryan said. It came out more direct than he intended, less composed, the words arriving before he had arranged them into something that didn't sound like what it actually was, which was a man who was not ready for a conversation to be over. "The program needs me somewhere else," Emily said. "When?" "Tonight. The meeting in Holt's office." "Yes." "Can you tell me where?" "No," she said, simply without apology. Ryan took a breath. He had prepared approximately nothing for this moment because he had not fully allowed himself to believe it was coming this fast, and now it was here, and he had about 30 seconds before the SUV left and took with it the most significant professional encounter of his life, and possibly something more than that, and he was standing in a parking area in Nevada running out of time. "The 3rd day of the show," he said. "Your 2nd performance. You're not going to fly it." "No. The slot will just be empty. Major Holt will film it." Ryan looked at her. "This was always the plan. You were never here for 3 days. Emily held his gaze. "I was here for exactly as long as I needed to be." One of the men near the SUV shifted his weight. The engine kept running. The desert had gone fully dark now, the Nevada stars doing their usual extravagant thing above a base that was lit up in the pragmatic, purposeful way of military facilities at night. "I want to ask you something," Ryan said. "And I want you to know that I'm asking because I actually want to know, not because I'm trying to hold you here or make the moment longer than it is." Emily waited. "Did it bother you," he said, "what I did the first morning, the clipboard, the things I said in front of everyone?" A pause that had real weight to it. "Yes," Emily said, "it bothered me." Ryan had expected her to say no. He had expected the composed, armored version of the answer, something that managed the moment and kept the distance. The honesty of the actual answer landed differently, harder, and better. "I'm sorry," he said. "I told you that before and I meant it, but I want to say it again now without anything else attached to it." Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You know what bothered me more than what you said?" "What?" "That you said it and then just went on, like the question was settled, like you'd evaluated the evidence and reached a conclusion and closed the file." She paused. "The mistake wasn't the laugh, Ryan. Everybody makes snap judgments. The mistake was being comfortable enough in that judgment that you stopped looking." Ryan felt this the way you feel something true, not like an impact, but like a key finding a lock, the recognition of something that was always there waiting to be seen. "I stopped looking," he said. "You stopped looking," she confirmed. "You've been doing it for a while, I think. Not just with me." The second man near the SUV checked his watch. Emily glanced at him, then back at Ryan. "I have to go," she said. "I know." She turned, took 2 steps, stopped without being called. "Ryan Arm," she said, her back still partly to him. "Yeah. You're an extraordinary pilot. I watched you fly the formation run twice. What you do with an aircraft is genuinely exceptional. Don't waste it." A pause. "And don't let it be the only thing you are. That's a small life for someone with that much capability." She walked to the SUV, the door closed. The vehicle moved toward the main gate and Ryan stood in the parking area and watched the taillights until they turned and disappeared, and the sound of the engine faded into the general sound of the Nevada night, which was wind and distant aircraft and the hum of a base that never fully slept. Miller appeared beside him. Of course Miller did. "She's gone," Miller said. "She's gone," Ryan said. They stood there for a moment. "She told you something," Miller said, not a question. "Several things," Ryan said. "Good things or hard things?" "Same thing," Ryan said. Miller nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's usually how it works with the people worth listening to." They walked back to the staging area without talking, and the base continued its evening around them, and somewhere in the maintenance hangar, the T-28 sat in its parking space with its inspection panels all closed and its old engine cool and the 2 painted-over words under its wing root invisible in the dark. The next morning arrived at Redstone Valley with the particular clarity of a desert day after something significant has happened, and the air itself seems to have decided to be clean and uncomplicated about it. The third and final day of the air show. The schedule was full. Major Holt had, as Emily predicted, filled the 2 p.m. slot with a ground demonstration team. Everything was organized and proceeding. Ryan arrived at the operations center at 6 a.m. I was earlier than usual, earlier than he needed to be for the day's schedule. He had slept better than he expected, which surprised him until he understood that the restlessness of the previous 2 nights had been the restlessness of someone who is fighting with something they haven't admitted yet, and admitting it even partially, even imperfectly, as he had started to do in the parking area last night, produces a specific kind of rest that's different from the rest of a clear conscience, quieter and less earned but real. Holt found him at this coffee station at 6:15. The major poured his own coffee and stood next to Ryan, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was itself something. Holt was not a man who stood next to people without purpose. "She brief you on anything?" Ryan asked finally. "Not in any way I can share," Holt said. "Did you know before she arrived what she was?" Holt looked at his coffee. "I knew enough to know that the level of approval her participation came with was not standard. The rest," he paused, "the rest I figured out the same way you did, by watching. And the prototype, Webb's aircraft. The timing of the failure and the timing of her presence on this base," Holt said carefully, "is a coincidence that I have chosen to stop examining too closely, because the alternative to coincidence requires a level of pre-mission planning and intelligence that I'm not cleared to know about." Ryan thought about this. Someone senior had known the prototype was going to have problems. Someone senior had put Emily at Redstone Valley specifically for that reason, wrapped in the cover of a civilian air show demonstration, in a vintage aircraft that made everyone underestimate her before she'd done a single thing. Someone had planned for the exact situation that had played out at 6 a.m. 2 mornings ago. "She was set up to succeed," Ryan said slowly. "Not just placed here, positioned here. Everything about how she arrived, how she looked, the aircraft she brought. All of it was designed to make everyone on this base look past her until she was needed." Holt said nothing. "And it worked," Ryan said. "It worked because I did exactly what it needed me to do. I made sure nobody looked at her twice." The specific discomfort of understanding yourself as the mechanism of someone else's operational plan was new territory for Ryan Mitchell, and it sat in him like something cold and educational. "Sir," Ryan said, "was I part of the setup intentionally?" Holt picked up his coffee. "Drink your coffee, Captain," he said, and walked away. Ryan stood at the coffee station for a long time. At 8:43 a.m., Webb found him. Webb was out of the medical bay and back in uniform, though he was still grounded from flying and would be for several more days pending a full incident review. He looked better than he had the morning before, more present, less shaken, the particular steadiness of a person who has processed a difficult thing and arrived on the other side of it. He sat down across from Ryan in the briefing room, which was empty at this hour. I heard she left last night, Webb said. Yeah. Did you get to talk to her? Some, Ryan said. Not enough. Webb was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. I've been thinking about what she told Okafor, he said. Hands off. Just stop fighting it and let the aircraft find its balance. He shook his head slowly. I've been flying experimental aircraft for 6 years. I have never once in any failure scenario, in any simulation or actual incident, been told to go hands off. Everything I've ever been taught says you maintain control inputs. You keep fighting. You don't give up authority. She knew something your training didn't, Ryan said. She knew something my training specifically contradicted, Webb said. That's different. What she knew wasn't just more advanced than my training. It was opposite, and she was right. He looked at Ryan directly. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from books, Ryan. It doesn't come from simulations. It doesn't even come from other pilots. That kind of knowledge comes from being in the aircraft when the book answer didn't work and surviving long enough to find the one that did. I know, Ryan said. She saved my life by knowing something nobody was supposed to know yet, Webb said. The incident review is going to document the failure mode. Okafor's team is going to write it up. In 6 months, maybe a year, there'll be a technical bulletin about the stability augmentation interaction, and test pilots will be briefed on it, and the training will be updated. He paused. But she already knew. She knew before the bulletin, before the documentation. Before anyone on this base knew this failure mode was possible, she had already survived it. Ryan said, she told me she flew operations she can't describe. Old aircraft, bad conditions, no backup. Ghostwriter, Webb said. Ryan looked at him. I did my own looking, Webb said. After you told me about the marking, I have clearances you don't given my program work, so I could access things you couldn't. He paused. The call sign appears in 4 separate after-action summaries from a classified test and evaluation program that ran for 11 years beginning in the early 2000s. Every reference is heavily redacted, but the pattern across all 4 references is the same mission failure scenarios that were considered unrecoverable by standard procedure, resolved by non-standard technique, executed by a call sign ghostwriter. He put his coffee cup down. One of the summaries notes that 2 other pilots attempted the same recovery sequence in simulation after the fact and could not replicate it. Not because they weren't good enough pilots, because the recovery required a physical knowledge of the aircraft's behavior at the edge of its envelope that only comes from having actually been there. Ryan said nothing. She's been in 4 documented situations where the aircraft should have killed her, Webb said. Documented. Those are just the ones with enough surviving paperwork to show up in a search. There are almost certainly more. He looked at Ryan steadily. And every single time she came back. And every time she came back, she was carrying something that didn't exist in any manual. The briefing room was quiet. Outside the base was a warming up for the 3rd show day. The sound of aircraft engines running through pre-flight checks moved through the walls, that familiar morning sound of machinery preparing to go into its element. I laughed at her aircraft, Ryan said. Yeah, Webb said. I heard. I made sure everyone around me laughed too. I heard that too. Ryan looked at the table. I was the reason nobody looked at her seriously for the first day and a half. The way I talked about her, the way I performed the dismissal, I set the tone for how the whole base treated her. And the whole time she was ghostwriter, Webb said simply, and you were being 27. Ryan looked up. I'm not excusing it, Webb said. I'm contextualizing it. You were 27 and talented and used to being the most impressive person in any room you walked into. And then someone arrived who was more impressive in every way that actually matters. And she arrived in a package that made it easy to look past. So you looked past. He paused. The question isn't why you did it. The question is what you do with understanding why. Ryan thought about what Emily had said in the parking area. Don't let it be the only thing you... She told me I was an extraordinary pilot, Ryan said. You are, Webb said, and that I was wasting it by letting it be the only thing I was. Webb nodded slowly. She said more in 2 sentences than most people manage in a 2-hour debrief. At 10:15 a.m., Sergeant Reyes came to find Ryan at the flight line. Reyes was a man of direct, practical communication. He said what he meant and meant what he said and did not typically seek out pilot conversations unless there was a specific operational reason. So the fact that he came was itself a signal, and Ryan gave him his full attention. The T-28, Reyes said. I did a full maintenance review this morning after she left. Went through everything she touched in her inspections. And, Ryan said, she found 4 additional issues over the course of the 3 days. Each one logged in her inspection notes and each one verified by my team when I sent them back to look. Reyes held up a small notepad, Emily's. Ryan realized she had left it or given it to Reyes deliberately. Hydraulic line with early stage degradation at the junction fitting. Left brake assembly with uneven wear pattern indicating a subtle alignment issue. Altimeter with a calibration drift of minus 40 feet, which sounds small until you're at 200 feet doing what she was doing on day 1. He paused. And a crack in the primary engine mount bolt that was invisible to standard inspection, but present under dye penetrant test. Not the secondary bracket she found on day 1, a different mount point. Ryan stared at him. She found 2 separate stress fractures in an aircraft that my entire maintenance crew had signed off on as airworthy, Reyes said. His voice was flat, but underneath the flatness was something that Ryan recognized as professional reckoning. A man who was good at his job, confronting evidence that good wasn't the same as good enough. If she had flown day 1 with the secondary bracket crack unfound and the primary mount crack unfound, the cumulative stress of the performance she put that aircraft through would have. He stopped. She found them before she got in, Ryan said. She found the first one before she got in, Reyes said. I reported that one and it got fixed. She found the second one on the morning of day 1 during a recheck she did without telling anyone, and she fixed it herself. There's a repair mark in the mount that's not in my maintenance log because she did it with tools from her own kit before my crew arrived for the morning. He paused. She was flying a structurally compromised aircraft. She found the compromises, she fixed what she could herself, she reported what needed proper repair, and then she got in and put that aircraft through maneuvers that would stress a healthy airframe because she knew exactly how much margin she had bought herself with the repairs, and she flew inside that margin. Ryan felt the magnitude of this arrange itself in him. She had found the problems, fixed the ones she could, reported the ones she couldn't, precisely assessed her own safety margin, and then flown the performance anyway because she understood the risk completely and had decided it was acceptable. Not recklessly, not carelessly, with total information, total calculation, and the specific kind of courage that is only available to someone who knows exactly what they're accepting. Sergeant, Ryan said, what is your read on her? Reyes looked at him for a moment. Then he said, my grandfather flew in Korea. B-26 Marauder. He told me once that the best pilots he ever saw were not the ones who were most skilled. He said skill was common enough among the people who made it to combat. The best pilots were the ones who knew the aircraft the way they knew their own hands, who could feel the machine the way you feel your own body when something's wrong. He paused. I've been working aircraft for 16 years. I've worked with some very good pilots. I've never once seen anyone work an aircraft inspection the way Emily Carter did. She wasn't checking the aircraft. She was listening to it. Ryan thought of what Emily had said about the T-28 getting very still before it decided you'd ask too much, about learning to hear what the aircraft was saying. She had told that to a 20-year-old ground crew member as if it were obvious, as if everyone who flew should know this, as if the gap between the people who knew it and the people who didn't was simply a matter of having paid enough attention. She had spent her career paying that attention in conditions where inattention ended conversations permanently. At 1:17 p.m., the final day of the air show was in full operation and Ryan was in his ready position for the afternoon formation slot when his phone buzzed. Unknown number, Nevada area code, but not one he recognized. He looked at it for 3 seconds, then answered. Mitchell, he said, a pause. Then you've been doing your research. Emily's voice. Ryan straightened involuntarily. Where are you? Somewhere, she said. I can't tell you more than that. Are you? He stopped, started again. Are you safe? A brief silence that was neither yes nor no. I wanted to tell you something before the reception signal gets complicated, Emily said. Holt is going to receive a recommendation from a program office that I'm not going to name. The recommendation will be for a training curriculum addition to Redstone Valley's advanced pilot development track. Non-standard approach techniques, degraded system management, low margin recovery procedures. A pause. The curriculum won't say where it comes from, but it comes from what I know. what I've carried, and it'll be here. Ryan stood very still. You're leaving something behind. Pilots are going to fly the machines that break, Emily said. They need to know what I know when that happens. It shouldn't require being ghostwriter to have that knowledge. It should be in the curriculum from the beginning. Ryan found suddenly and without much warning that he was having difficulty with his voice. He managed, how long have you been working on that curriculum? A few years, Emily said. It needed a test base, somewhere with the right mix of equipment, personnel, and program access. Redstone Valley was the right fit. That's why you came, Ryan said. Not just Webb's aircraft, all of it. The curriculum needs to be validated. You needed to see how pilots here respond, what they know and what they were missing. The air show was real, Emily said. I told you that. The flying is always real. But the assessment was also real. A pause. Everything I do is real, Emily said. I don't do anything halfway. That's the one thing I'd ask you to remember. The formation clock on Ryan's wrist beeped. 10 minutes to his slot. Emily, he said. Yeah. The curriculum, will you have any involvement in it going forward? The pause this time was longer. That's not something I can answer right now, she said. There are operational decisions above she stopped, then differently. There are things I don't control. I wish I could tell you more. Will I see you again? The question sat between them over a phone connection somewhere in Nevada, and the desert wind moved over the flight line, and the aircraft waiting for their afternoon runs hummed with the specific readiness of machines about to be used. And Ryan Mitchell held his phone and waited for an answer from a woman he had known for 3 days and understood he would spend a significant amount of the rest of his career thinking about. I don't know, Emily said. Maybe. Then fly well today, Ryan. The line went quiet. Ryan stood on the flight line with his phone in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket. Then he buckled his helmet and walked to his aircraft with a walk that was different from his usual walk. Not slower, not less confident, but changed in some quality of awareness, some additional attention to the ground under his feet and the people around him and the weight of the machine he was about to take into the air. He ran his pre-flight check with more care than he had run one in 2 years. He ran it the way he imagined Emily Carter would run it. Not by the book alone, but by the book and by every sense he had, listening to the aircraft the way she had listened to the T-28 touching the surfaces, feeling for the things that didn't translate correctly, asking the machine what it was telling him, and actually waiting for the answer. His crew chief watched him. Everything okay, Captain? The chief asked. Better than usual, actually, Ryan said. The chief looked at him with the faint expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. Ryan climbed in. The formation run that afternoon was the best Ryan Mitchell had ever flown at Redstone Valley. Not because the technical execution was different. The choreography was the same. The positions were the same. The altitude and speed profiles were unchanged. But something in the quality of Ryan's attention was different. And when the pilot's attention changes, the aircraft feels it. And when the aircraft feels it, the flight changes. And when the flight changes, the people watching can feel that too, even if they couldn't name what they were responding to. Miller noticed from the ground. Afterward, walking back from the flight line, he fell into step beside Ryan and said, "She called." Ryan looked at him. "How did you know?" "Because you flew like you were carrying something worth flying for," Miller said. "And that's different from flying like you have something to prove." Ryan thought about this for a moment. "Is it obvious?" "Only to someone who knows what to look for," Miller said, which is apparently her lesson in everything. They reached the staging area. The third day of the Redstone Valley Air Show was winding toward its close, the crowds beginning to move toward the exits. The ground crews beginning the intricate work of post-show recovery, the pilots beginning to decompress in the particular way pilots decompress after a performance, physically carefully, with a lot of quiet. Ryan sat down at the long table. I thought about Emily Carter in a government SUV, moving through the Nevada night to something she couldn't name, carrying what she knew from places the official record would not describe, going back to the operational world that had made ghostwriter out of a girl from Kansas who just wanted to fly. He thought about the T-28 in the hangar with its 2 painted-over words under the wing root and its repaired engine mounts and its inspection panels all properly closed. I thought about Webb at 12,000 feet, hands off the controls, betting his life on a stranger's certainty. He thought about the curriculum that was going to arrive at Redstone Valley without a name attached to it. carrying knowledge that had been bought in the most expensive possible currency, experience at the absolute edge in conditions that didn't allow for second attempts. And he thought about what Miller had just said, flying like you have something worth flying for, not something to prove, something worth flying for. He had spent 7 years, his entire adult career, flying like he had something to prove, proving it to rooms, to rosters, to a hierarchy that rewarded visible excellence and measurable achievement, proving it in ways that were real and genuine and had produced real and genuine results. He was, in fact, exceptional. That had always been true, but exceptional for what? Excellent in service of what? Flying in the direction of what exactly? He hadn't asked. He had been too busy being the answer to ask what the question was. Emily had asked. Her whole career had been organized around a question, not how good can I be, but what does good actually mean when the stakes are real and there's no audience, and the aircraft is broken, and the margin is zero, and the person next to you needs to get home. That was the question. That was the curriculum she was leaving behind. At 7 p.m., Major Holt found Ryan in the staging area and handed him a sealed envelope. This was left at the main gate this morning, Holt said, for you specifically, by name. Ryan looked at the envelope. His name was written on it in a handwriting that was economical and clear, the penmanship of someone who had spent years writing in small spaces on moving platforms. He opened it. Inside was a single card, 3 lines. The aircraft talks if you listen. The margin is real if you measure it. The rest is just weather, no signature. Below the 3 lines in smaller writing, the curriculum arrives in 6 weeks. Make them listen to it. Ryan read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his flight suit against his chest, where he would feel it when he breathed. He sat in the staging area as the base shifted into its evening routines around him, and the Nevada sky went dark again above the flight line, and the air show was over, and Redstone Valley Air Base began incrementally and irrevocably to be different from what it had been 4 days ago. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific way that things change when someone passes through a place and leaves the shape of what they know behind, and the people who received it are good enough to recognize it and honest enough to let it change them. Ryan Mitchell was at this particular moment in his life becoming honest enough. It was a start. It was, he understood now, the only start that ever actually counted for anything. 6 weeks passed. Ryan Mitchell counted them the way you count time when you are waiting for something you cannot control and have decided to trust anyway. Not obsessively, not with daily calculation, but with the background awareness of someone who knows a date is coming and has chosen to spend the time between now and then doing something useful. He spent those 6 weeks differently than he had spent any previous 6 weeks of his career. He started arriving at the flight line before his crew. Not to be seen arriving early, not to establish the performance of diligence, but because the early hours were quiet and the aircraft were still, and he had developed in the last days of the air show a habit of spending time with his aircraft before anyone else arrived, checking things that had already been checked, listening for what the machine might be telling him that a standard pre-flight would not capture. He never found anything the maintenance crew had missed. That was not the point. The point was the practice of attention itself, the daily cultivation of a quality of focus that he understood now was either built or lost, never simply maintained. Miller noticed everything which Ryan had stopped finding faintly irritating and started finding genuinely valuable. "You're doing the Emily thing," Miller said one morning, appearing at Ryan's shoulder as Ryan crouched beside his aircraft's landing gear with a flashlight. "The Emily thing," Ryan repeated. "The inspection that isn't really about finding problems," Miller said. "It's about knowing the aircraft, staying in relationship with it." Ryan looked up at him. "Is that what it looks like from outside?" "It looks like a man who learned something and is trying to live in it," Miller said. "Yeah." Ryan went back to the landing gear. "I found a hairline in the tire sidewall last Tuesday," he said. "Crew had it on the replacement list, hadn't gotten to it yet. I caught it 2 days before the scheduled check." Miller was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would be unsurprised." "I know," Ryan said. "That's the point." Webb came back to flight status 22 days after the incident. His return to the cockpit was carefully managed, a graduated reintroduction to flight operations that the flight surgeons and the program officials had negotiated with the precision of people who understood that what Webb had experienced was not just a mechanical emergency but a psychological event, and that the psychological event required as much management as the mechanical one. Ryan flew the first check flight with him, not because protocol required it, because Webb asked. They went up in a two-seat trainer at 9 a.m. on a clear Nevada morning, and they flew for 2 hours, and for most of that 2 hours, they didn't talk at all because Webb was in the front seat listening to the aircraft, and Ryan was in the back seat doing the same thing, and the silence between them was not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people engaged in the same focused practice. On the way back to the field, Webb said over the intercom, "She was right about the hands-off." "I know," Ryan said. "Not just for my specific situation," Webb said. "As a principle, there are moments when the correct response to a failing system is to stop inputting, to let the aircraft tell you what it's doing before you decide what to do about it. We don't train that, we train the opposite." "The curriculum is supposed to address it," Ryan said. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks from when? From the morning of the last show day. Webb was quiet. "Then that's tomorrow." Ryan had not allowed himself to do the calculation out loud until this moment, but he had known it. The way you know things, you are trying not to be too attached to carrying the knowledge quietly, because attaching it to expectation creates a kind of pressure that changes how you hold it. "Yeah," Ryan said, "that's tomorrow." They landed without further discussion. That night, Ryan sat at his desk and read the card again. He had read it approximately 40 times over the previous 6 weeks, not because the words changed, but because he changed, and each time he read it, the words landed in a slightly different place, against a slightly different version of himself, and the slight differences accumulated into something that was beginning to feel like a new direction rather than a deviation from the old one. The aircraft talks if you listen. The margin is real if you measure it. The rest is just weather. He understood the first 2 lines immediately and had understood them better with each passing week. The third line had taken him longer. The rest is just weather. Fear, reputation, other people's opinions, the performance of confidence, the constructed identity of being the best, the social architecture of a career built on visible excellence in a community that worshiped visible excellence. Whether real, present, capable of affecting you, not capable of being controlled, and not worth spending your primary energy fighting. You check the weather. You account for it. You don't build your flight plan around defeating it. He put the card back in his breast pocket. He went to sleep. The envelope arrived at 7:14 a.m. the next morning. Not delivered by the government SUV. Not dropped off by a staff sergeant from a program office. It arrived by standard inter-office mail, inside a plain manila envelope addressed to Major Dennis Holt, with no return address and a Las Vegas postmark. Inside the manila envelope was a second envelope sealed with Ryan's name on it, in the same economical handwriting as the card. Inside the second envelope was a document, 43 pages printed, double-sided, with no header, no classification marking, no program designation, no author credit. The title on the first page in plain text was Non-Standard Recovery Procedures for High-Performance Aircraft Operating in Degraded System States. Holt called Ryan to his office at 7:45 a.m. He handed Ryan the document across his desk and watched him turn the first few pages with the expression of a man who has been doing his job long enough to recognize significant things when they arrive in plain packaging. "Read the introduction," Holt said. Ryan read it. The introduction was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph established the document's purpose, a curriculum supplement for advanced pilot development programs, covering recovery techniques for failure scenarios not addressed in standard training. The second paragraph described the source of the material operational experience accumulated across multiple high-performance aircraft platforms in conditions requiring non-standard problem solving. The third paragraph contained a single sentence that made Ryan stop reading. The sentence said, "The procedures in this document were developed and validated in actual flight operations, not simulation, and the margins described are real margins derived from real experience. Treat them accordingly." The fourth paragraph said, "This document is dedicated to every pilot who has been in an aircraft that was failing and had to find the answer themselves. You deserve to have this before you needed it." Ryan read the fourth paragraph twice. Then he looked up at Holt. "She wrote it," Ryan said, "not a question." "The document has no author," Holt said carefully. "She wrote it," Ryan said again. Holt did not confirm or deny this. He simply looked at Ryan with the expression he wore when he was carrying information he was not going to share and had made his peace with it. Then he said the program office that sent this has requested that it be integrated into Redstone Valley's advanced pilot curriculum beginning with the next training cycle. They have provided a funding authorization for an additional training slot and for whatever instructor resources are required to deliver it effectively. Ryan looked at the document in his hands. 43 pages, the distillation of 6 years of operational experience in places that didn't have public records in aircraft that were old and broken and insufficient for the missions they were asked to perform, executed by a pilot who had carried everything she learned forward in her body and in her memory because there was no other place to put it. Until now. Who teaches it? Ryan asked. Holt looked at him for a long moment. The program office, Holt said, has suggested a pilot at this base who they believe has the technical background and the recent experience with the document's source material to deliver it effectively. He paused. They named you specifically Captain Mitchell. Ryan stared at him. Me, he said. You, Holt said. I haven't experienced any of the operational scenarios in this document. I've never been in a degraded. You watch someone apply this knowledge in real time, Holt said. You understand it contextually in a way that most pilots at this base do not because you were present when it mattered. And he paused again, choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who knows the weight of what he's saying. The program office has indicated that the person who developed this curriculum believes you are capable of teaching not just the technical content, but the underlying principle it comes from. Ryan was quiet. What underlying principle, he said, though some part of him already knew. Holt looked at him steadily. That what you don't know can kill you faster than what you do. And that the first step to being a pilot worth trusting is understanding the difference between confidence and knowledge and never letting one pretend to be the other. The room was very quiet. Ryan looked down at the document again, at the fourth paragraph, at the last sentence. You deserve to have this before you needed it. She had written a curriculum for the pilots who were going to be in broken aircraft at 12,000 feet with no good options, and she had asked Ryan Mitchell, the man who had laughed at her aircraft and thrown her name away before he knew it, to be the one to put it in their hands. Because she believed he understood it now. Because she believed he had changed enough to carry it without dropping it. He held the 43 pages and felt the weight of them, which was not the physical weight of paper, but the weight of what the paper contained and what it had cost to contain it and what it would now mean for the pilots who received it before they found themselves in the situations that had taught Emily Carter everything she knew. I'll teach it, Ryan said. The training cycle began 4 weeks later. Ryan spent those 4 weeks preparing in a way he had never prepared for anything. He read the 43 pages until he could close his eyes and see each procedure in sequence. He spent hours with Okafor going through the flight system's content, filling gaps in his engineering knowledge, so that when he explained failure modes to student pilots, he could explain not just what to do, but why the physics produced the situation in the first place. He talked to Webb extensively about the hands-off experience, what it had felt like, what the decision point had been, what the internal conversation was like in the cockpit, in the moment when following training and following the correct answer pointed in opposite directions. Webb gave him something better than a description. He gave him a confession. I was terrified, Webb said. Not of the aircraft failing, of looking like I didn't know what to do, of the incident review, of what it would mean for my record if I did something unorthodox and it didn't work. He paused. When Okafor told me to go hands off, my first instinct was not to evaluate whether it was right. My first instinct was to think about how it would look in the report if I did something my training specifically said not to do, and the aircraft went into the ground. He shook his head. That instinct almost killed me. Not the aircraft failure, my own concern about my reputation. Ryan wrote this down, not the words exactly, but the shape of it. He wrote, reputation is not a survival tool. Then he sat with that for a long time. I thought about himself on day one of the air show, standing at the head of the briefing room with the roster in his hand. He thought about the grin that had spread across his face, designed and performed for an audience of fellow pilots, calibrated to produce laughter and agreement, and the specific social reward of being the person who sets the tone in a room. He thought about how good it had felt, how natural, how completely he had been serving his reputation and calling it judgment. Reputation is not a survival tool. He put it in the curriculum. The first training session was a Tuesday morning in November, 3 months after the air show. 12 pilots, a mix of experience levels, some with Ryan's hours, some with less, two with more. They sat in the briefing room and they looked at Ryan Mitchell, who was standing at the front of the room where he had stood many times before, and they waited for what he was going to say. He started with a story, not the technical material, not the procedures, a story. He told them about a civilian woman who drove onto Redstone Valley Air Base in a truck, held together with electrical tape, carrying an old flight helmet and a set of topographic maps, and a level of knowledge that nobody in the room had been prepared for, and what had happened in the 3 days she was there, and what it had cost him to understand what he had been looking at. He told it plainly, without sparing himself, without managing the impression he made on the people listening. He told them about laughing at the aircraft, about the things he had said in front of an audience that he could not take back. He told them about standing at the fence watching her fly and feeling the specific discomfort of understanding that you have dismissed something you should have been paying attention to. He told them about Webb at 12,000 feet and about what Webb had told him regarding the instinct to protect his reputation over his life. He told them about 43 pages that had arrived in a plain envelope with no author's name, written by a woman who had survived 4 documented situations where the aircraft should have ended the conversation permanently because she wanted pilots she had never met to have the knowledge she had paid the maximum price to acquire. The room was very quiet by the time he finished. A pilot named Torres, the same Torres who had been at the debrief after the air show, who had described Emily's low-altitude recovery with the words, "Those are not margins," raised his hand. "Who wrote the curriculum?" Torres asked. Ryan looked at him. "Someone who was there," Ryan said. "In all the situations this curriculum covers. Someone who went through the failure modes that didn't have procedures, found the answers, came back, and wrote them down for us." He paused. "The name doesn't matter as much as what the name cost. Just know that every page of what you're going to read was paid for in real aircraft, at real altitude, with real consequences. Treat it accordingly." Torres looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded. They opened the document. 6 months after the air show, Ryan was in his aircraft at altitude when the radio crackled with something unusual. A communications test from a frequency he didn't use day-to-day, routed through channels that weren't part of the standard operational network. The kind of communication path that people use when the standard paths are too visible. A voice, brief, clear. "Ghost Rider actual. How's the weather?" Ryan felt something shift in his chest. He keyed his radio. "Manageable," he said. "How's yours?" A pause. "Complicated," Emily's voice said. "But that's usual." "Are you—" He stopped. Tried again. "Are you okay?" "Operational," she said, which was not the same as okay, and both of them knew it, but it was the answer she could give on a channel with unknown listeners, and he understood that and accepted it. "The curriculum started," Ryan said, 6 weeks ago. 12 pilots in the first cohort. 2 more cohorts scheduled for next year. Holt is pushing for it to go to 3 other bases." A brief silence. "Good," Emily said. And in that single word was something he hadn't heard in her voice before, not during the air show, not in the operations center, not in the parking area when she was leaving. Something that sounded like relief. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally found a place to set it down. "The 4th paragraph," Ryan said. "In the introduction, the dedication." "Yeah," she said. "You deserve to have this before you needed it," Ryan said. "When did you write that?" Another pause. "Longer." "After the 3rd time," Emily said. "After the 3rd time I was in a failing aircraft, and the answer I found wasn't in any manual, and I had to carry it out by myself." Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that Ryan was only now calibrated enough to hear, the specific quality of a person who has been alone with a difficult thing for long enough that aloneness has become part of the thing itself. "I thought if I ever got through all of it, if there was ever a version of this knowledge that didn't have to live only in me, I wanted to put it somewhere that pilots could find it before they needed it, not after." "It's there," Ryan said. "It's in their hands." "I know," she said. "Thank you for that." Ryan had not expected the thank you. It landed in a way he needed a moment to absorb. "I should be the one saying that," he said. "We'll disagree on that," Emily said. And something in her voice had shifted again, a slight easing, a fraction of warmth. The sound of someone who has been guarded for so long that warmth requires a specific kind of trust to surface, and who was in this particular moment extending that trust. Emily, Ryan said. Yeah, the things I said at the start, on the tarmac. Ryan, I know I apologized. I know we've covered it. I need to say it one more time without any context around it. He paused. I was wrong, not just in what I said, in the whole structure of how I was thinking, in the assumption that I could evaluate what someone had to offer based on how they arrived. I was wrong, and I caused you something real, and I've spent 6 months trying to be different enough that it cost me something to be wrong that way again. He paused. I think I'm getting there. The radio was quiet for a moment. Then Emily said, yeah, I think you are too. A beat. Fly well, Ryan. Ryan, she said. Fly safe, he said. The frequency went quiet. Ryan sat at altitude in the clear air over Nevada and held the silence that came after her voice and let it be what it was. Not empty, not lonely, but the particular silence of a conversation that has said exactly what it needed to say and doesn't need to be longer than it was. He looked out at the sky. The sky over Nevada in winter is a specific thing, deep and cold and so clear it feels almost aggressive about it, like the air itself has decided to be completely honest about the distance between things. Ryan had flown in this sky hundreds of times and had never quite looked at it the way he looked at it now, which was with the understanding that the sky did not care about his reputation or his call sign or his performance reviews, and that what it asked of anyone who entered it was simply the truth of what they actually knew and what they actually didn't. Emily had understood this from the beginning, from the first moment she had carried no performance into the air, only knowledge, only capability, only the absolute unsentimental honesty of a pilot who had been tested by the sky's indifference enough times to stop pretending to it. That was what Ghostwriter was, not a classification, not a legend, not a call sign in a redacted document. It was the name the sky gave to someone who had been completely honest with it at the worst possible moments and had found the answer anyway. 1 year after the air show, Ryan was standing in the briefing room at the front of a new cohort. Different faces, same room, the Nevada winter outside, the sound of aircraft engines running through pre-flight checks, that constant, reliable sound that meant the work was beginning again. He set the 43 pages on the table. 14 pilots looked at them. Ryan looked at the room, at these 14 people who were in most cases genuinely excellent pilots, talented, committed, trained to a high standard by a system that had invested significant resources in making them capable, and who did not yet know what they didn't know, who were in the way of all people who have not been tested at the absolute edge, carrying their confidence and their capability as if those two things were the same weight, the same substance, the same guarantee. He knew this because he had been exactly this. For 7 years, he had been exactly this. I'm going to start, Ryan said, by telling you about the worst mistake I made in my career. And then I'm going to tell you about the woman who showed me what it cost. He started talking, and the 14 pilots leaned forward, and the engines ran outside. And somewhere in the sky over Nevada, or somewhere else in an aircraft that was old or broken or insufficient for the mission, it was being asked to perform a woman who had given her knowledge. Its best possible home was doing the next thing the operational world required of her with the same quality of focus, in the same absolute honesty that she brought to everything, carrying what she knew in her body, in her memory, and her hands until the next time it was needed. The sky did not advertise what it knew about her. It never had. But every pilot at Redstone Valley Air Base who opened those 43 pages and read the 4th paragraph of the introduction understood in the part of themselves where real knowledge lives that something rare and hard-earned had been passed to them. And in briefing rooms and at flight lines and in the early morning hours when pilots crouched beside their aircraft with flashlights, listening for what the machine was saying, the knowledge moved forward. Quietly, without a name attached, the way the most important things always travel. Ghostwriter had come to Redstone Valley in a truck, held together with electrical tape, and left without ceremony, and left everything behind that mattered. And that was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.